Hello, everybody. I'm Rob Crawford, and in response to events that occurred last fall at the Center for Human Rights, the faculty associates at UW-Tacoma decided to organize a program about the center and its current work in Central America. So this is that event. We sent an open letter to the campus that many of you might have read in response to those events. So I would like to our chancellor is here today, Mark Pagano, and he's going to make just a few welcoming remarks. Mark?
Thank you very much, Professor Crawford. I actually met Professor Crawford as a result of the events that you're going to be discussing today. I believe he sent a combined letter out to our faculty here on campus, and I responded to his letter and got to know him. But anyway, welcome. We love to have events like this on our campus. Welcome to our colleagues from Seattle. You've seen the light and come down to Tacoma for the day. Good. But I've been so proud to be associated with this university for the past 10 months. You know, we call ourselves an urban serving university, and that puts a twist on our university, which really focuses on no matter what the discipline is that you're studying. I know students in this auditorium right now are studying a lot of different important disciplines for society, but no matter what the discipline, we put in that a focus on human rights, upon social justice, upon doing the right thing for your colleagues, your friends, your fellow man, the environment, the animals, what have it. So I really love that focus of our university. One of the things I wanted to tell you is myself, and I don't know if I speak for Dr. Crawford or not, I might get myself in trouble here, but we're getting towards the end of our careers. But every day we get to, well, we kind of are. We're closer to the end than the beginning. Will you agree with that much? Okay, we're closer to the end of our careers rather than the beginning. But we get to come here every day and work with people who are the future. You know, we still might change the world before we're done. But you, as our students, have every opportunity to make great impacts on the world, and you will have come from the University of Washington-Tacoma. So that's exciting to us. So I see my job as paving the way for professors like Professor Crawford and some of the other faculty we have in the room to do what they do, to inspire our students to go out into the world, take this learning, and make impact for social good. So before I stop, I'd be happy to take one question or two questions. Before I leave, I'm actually going to Olympia to try to convince our legislative contingent to continue to fund us since we're reducing your tuition. They've promised to give us a little bit more to make up for that. So somebody needs to go down there and remind them about that. So I'll be doing that this afternoon. Any question before I leave? Anything else you want me to say? You good? Well, thank you all for having. Enjoy the event.
Great honor. Hi, I'm Michael Foreman. I'm in the faculty on this campus. I'm also a member of the steering committee for the Center for Human Rights. I want to thank you all for attending this very important talk by Dr. Angelina Godoy and Ms. Emily Willard. I also want to thank the Division of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs and the UWT Associates of the Center for Human Rights who sponsored this. A very special thanks goes to my colleagues Rob Crawford and Ben Meaches, who actually really organized this talk. Ben did a tremendous job, and he's just basically landed here. Dr. Angelina Snodgrass Godoy holds the Helen M. Jackson Chair in Human Rights, and she's the director of the University of Washington Center for Human Rights. The center was established by the legislature to promote support and research and teaching and to further human rights. Dr. Godoy, who is a sociologist by training, has led the center from its inception with great enthusiasm and skill and effectiveness. We are all very grateful for her work. Her research focuses on human rights in Central America, especially Guatemala and El Salvador. Emily Willard is a Ph.D. student in the Jackson School. Her work is about women in armed groups in Latin America, in Central America, excuse me. Both Dr. Godoy and Ms. Willard are involved in the center's Unfinished Sentences project, And I want to thank you both for coming.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you so much to all of you for being here, and in particular, of course, to Rob and Ben for all their work organizing this. It was a very generous introduction. What I would like to do first is take you all into the heart of what motivates me the most in this work. Before you hear me rattle on like an academic about it, I'd like you to see the heart of what we do. And in order to show you that, what I would like you to watch is just a 7-minute film that my students made in 2015, so just last year, about some extraordinary people we have the opportunity to work with in El Salvador.
Mi nombre es Salvador García y busco a Cristabel García Esquivel.
Bueno, mi nombre es Marta Arias y busco a mis 3 sobrinos que me desaparecieron con mi hermana.
Mi nombre es Amparo Salinas y busco a Santos Ernesto Salinas.
Mi nombre es Milagro del Pilar Martínez y yo busco a mis 2 hijos desaparecidos que me quitaron en el momento del conflicto armado.
La guerra fue triste aquí en El Salvador, fue dura. Las masacres que hubieron, las masacres fue... Todo se quemó, era una invasión de la tierra arrasada que le decían. Que allí comaban todito. Animales, gente, ancianos, niños, volaban milpas, todito. Eso fue. Ese operativo fue eso fue la más tremenda, 81.
Y yo salí con las señoras a un lugar del Cuarenteño y yo las di por libre, donde había más gente las dejé allí y me dediqué a buscar a mi familia, jamás di con ellos. Hasta que los buscamos y ya los hallé muertos. Ayer toda esa gente que hallé masacrada yo en esa zona donde está ese mural alrededor, yo hallé como 500 personas.
Cuando la autoridad entraba a los cantones, nosotros nos íbamos a huir porque no los tocaba más que otra, que si nos quedamos en las casas nos iban a matar, porque muchos murieron así. Entonces, pues algunos teníamos miedo y nos íbamos a huir con los niños. Y entonces cuando venía la invasión nos fuimos al monte a huir con los niños. Allí nos caímos en una emboscada de la Fuerza Armada y nos atrapó, pues. Allí nos hicieron la balacera y nos siguieron hasta no cansarnos, nos quitaron nuestros hijos.
Era tan especial mi hermano que todos pues sí lo queríamos, ¿verdad? Porque él era el último, o sea que para nosotros era el niño, él es Santos Ernesto Salinas. Algunos pues han tenido la dicha de poderlos encontrar, abrazarlos, pero es con mi hermano no se dio eso.
Un ser querido no se borra nunca, solo el momento que estoy dormida, pero siempre con esa alegría en mi corazón de revivir a mí o a mi hija al momento que sea, aunque sería el último momento de mi vida, pero lo haría de todo corazón.
Los orígenes de ProBúsqueda nacen en la organización campesina de madres, padres y familiares de niños que fueron desaparecidos durante el conflicto armado. Nosotros los primeros indicios que recabamos son prueba testimonial. Es en función de los testimonios de personas que estuvieron cerca o participaron en estos operativos y nos dan datos de dónde pudieron llevarse estos niños o si fueron ejecutados en el operativo militar, ¿verdad? De ahí empezamos a reconstruir toda la historia. En muchos de los casos, en la mayoría, encontramos que a estos niños, niñas, se les cambió la identidad, se les cambió el nombre, se les dieron por abandono y hicieron trámites ilegales de adopciones o poco legales, ¿verdad? Entendemos que la familia receptora, la familia adoptiva, no tuvieron culpa, puesto que en la mayoría de los casos adoptaron de buena voluntad, pero sí, para nosotros el caso ideal es eso, ¿no? Cuando se reencuentran ambas familias con la persona en medio, que es el objeto de sentimiento, de ilusión, de agrandar esa familia, ¿no? La adoptiva, la biológica y la persona reencontrada.
Porque ProBúsqueda quizás somos todos los familiares, ¿verdad? De los que tenemos familiares desaparecidos, ¿verdad? Para esa época del conflicto armado. Y sí, quizás entre todos pues, nos damos quizás ánimo.
Durante esté viva, yo siempre voy a existir y voy a apoyarlos en la ProBúsqueda, porque se han encontrado, muchos encuentros hemos ido y muchos muchachos se han encontrado, bastante más muchachos, pues si no los encuentro, pues otras personas tendrán esa dicha de hallar su familia.
Quizá ProBúsqueda sea de las pocas organizaciones que ha entendido lo que significa la reconciliación después de una guerra, ¿no? Es precisamente eso, el poder reconstruir su historia, saber sus orígenes, saber qué pasó, cómo pasó y poderse encontrar y ampliar esa familia, ese núcleo familiar. Ese es el resarcimiento.
Pues yo, como digo, ese momento yo siempre he luchado por eso y le pido a Dios que primero Dios algún día voy a tener esa oportunidad. Siempre he soñado, siempre he luchado por eso.
Okay, so I want to share with you a little bit more about our meeting with La Niña Milagro. That's the woman there in the middle, or Doña Milagro. In rural El Salvador, they call women out of respect Niña in poor rural communities. So she's Niña Milagro, and her story will always be very personally impactful for me, because I had the opportunity, as you can see here, with a group of students, some of whom are pictured here, not all, last February to travel to El Salvador and to meet with her alongside many other Salvadoran families who were victims and survivors of the practice of forced disappearance of children, as the film showed. Niña Milagro has a particularly powerful story. She was fleeing, as you heard a little bit of it in the film, she was fleeing from the armed forces with 5 children, 5 of her children. And when the military caught up with her, they killed 2 of her children right before her eyes, and they took away 2 other children, took them away alive, and 1 of her children survived. And she spent the next 34 years until that day that my students and I, this day right here, you see in the picture that we arrived at her house, which is in a very remote area. It took us a long time to get there. This was towards the end of a week of exhausting conversations, research on a very difficult topic. And the conversations we had with her were particularly powerful because she was commenting about, after 34 years, how difficult it is to keep hope alive, that you might find those children. And yet, as any parent can understand, that hope will never die. You'll never let that hope dim, because you would do anything, go to the ends of the earth to find your child if there was a possibility that he or she could be found alive. So Milagro and many other women and men like her are extraordinary examples of the struggle for human rights in El Salvador. There are people who suffered horrific violence many decades ago and who still today are working in a climate of extreme adversity to defend human rights. But why is this story, in a world where sadly these kinds of stories are so common, and all it takes is to turn on the TV or access the internet to know that there's so much suffering in our world, why is her story particularly important to focus on today? Well, for a few reasons. One, first of all, as a scholar of human rights, the atrocities that took place in El Salvador in the context of the Salvadoran Civil War between 1980 and 1992 are among the worst atrocities that humankind has seen. Now, I'm not trying to say El Salvador suffered more than other countries. What I'm trying to say is these are the really deep and challenging human rights questions. How do we prevent the descent into civil war? How do we deal with societies as they emerge? What does justice mean in this context? What does healing mean for somebody like Niña Milagro? El Salvador provides a laboratory from which to understand those most important of human rights questions, the big questions of our field. So El Salvador is a very important place to look at for that reason. El Salvador is also a place that should matter deeply to us, I would say, as Americans, or speaking myself as an American, because the United States government supported the Salvadoran government that was carrying out these acts of atrocity against its population, including its civilian population, people like Niña Milagro. The United States supported that government in the context of the Cold War and the fear of communism. El Salvador descended into an armed conflict between leftist rebels who were inspired by Marxist ideas and a right-wing government. And the United States, a series of governments in the United States, a series of administrations, chose to support the Salvadoran government with training, with weapons, with funds, with equipment, at a number that we know is somewhere beyond the $5 billion mark. So we know that money that was legally accounted for going to El Salvador reached $5 billion. We also know that there was a great deal of covert assistance that went to El Salvador, the numbers and full dimension of which we still do not know to this day. So there's a question here for us as a nation when it becomes clear that such grievous wrongs were inflicted by a government we defined as our allies and who we were supporting. There's a question about what we should do with that legacy of our country's involvement, and I think that's a particularly important thing for us to grapple with. But lastly, thirdly, I think this is an issue that should matter to us as academics, as people at an institution involved in research and learning, because I really believe, and this is the story I want to tell you most of all today, that this is a story, while it's marked by tremendous tragedy, it's also marked by enormous opportunity for people like you and me to actually make a difference in the healing process. And that's an amazing thing. It's an amazing privilege that I've had a chance to be a part of this, and so I want to share with you just a little glimpse of that privilege in the minutes I have before you today. So first of all, just by way of background, I've already mentioned a few things. You've already seen the film, mentioned a few others, but the armed conflict in El Salvador, which was the context in which these atrocities were committed, is generally, the dates of it are generally accepted to have begun around 1980 and to have concluded in 1992. Sometimes people describe this war as sort of bookended by two horrific acts of violence. The first of them being the assassination of Archbishop Romero, who you see here on the left. And while this was not the last act of violence in the war by any stretch of the imagination, in 1989, the slaughter of 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper and her daughter on the campus of the Jesuit University in San Salvador, which is what you see here, was also a clear turning point that made it very clear that the war needed to be brought to a conclusion. And it eventually ended with the signing of peace accords in 1992. After those peace accords were signed, the UN conducted a truth commission in El Salvador to examine the events that caused such grievous harm during the war, and concluded on the basis of exhaustive research that some 75,000 civilians had lost their lives. Now, civilians there is a key word, right? Because we're talking about a civil war between two armed groups, but when we talk about that 75,000 number, we're talking about people who weren't in either of those camps. These were not combat deaths. These were civilians, people like the children of Niña Milagro. 75,000 is also a number that can be a bit numbing, right? So think about it this way, that if you take that proportionally to the size of the Salvadoran population at the time, that's a little bit like the size of the population of the greater LA basin in the United States right now. So imagine what it would do, what kind of a hole it would blow in the social fabric of this country if suddenly, or over 10 years, the population of Los Angeles and its surrounding communities were wiped out in a tragic internecine conflict like this. That'll give you one sense of how huge a conflict this was. And the Truth Commission concluded, and this is a very important data point, that some 85% of those fatalities were attributed to the Salvadoran government itself, to its military and paramilitary forces or security forces. So that means the government, again, the government that the United States was supporting very heavily throughout this period. In fact, more of the dollars that funded those bullets came from the United States and from American coffers than from Salvadoran coffers during the war. That means that that government itself is primarily attributed, the violence is primarily attributable to them. Now what about the guerrillas, the leftist rebels? Some 5% of the killings were attributed to them too, and that's also a grievous wrong. It's a grievous human rights abuse. But it's important to keep in mind the proportionality of violence that those numbers reveal. So, yes? 85 and 5. So then you might say, what happened to the other 10? And those other 10% are attributed to death squads that weren't, well, they had a shadowy relationship to the government, but that's different than army soldiers or police officers, right? So 10% death squads, 5% guerrillas, 85% state forces. Okay, so what, when that Truth Commission rendered its report immediately after the conclusion of the war, but actually before they had even begun their work, 5 days after the Truth Commission concluded its work, the Salvadoran version of Congress, their legislative assembly, gathered and said, we're going to pass a law, which is an amnesty law, which will guarantee that nobody will be prosecuted for all of these crimes. So El Salvador passed an amnesty law that still today is on the books. It has been found by numerous courts, both in El Salvador and internationally, to not be in compliance with El Salvador's international human rights obligations, and therefore those courts have ordered that it not be interpreted as a true impediment to prosecution. Nonetheless, and if you have more questions about that, I'm happy to answer them. But nonetheless, to this day, right now, not one person is serving time for having ordered these atrocities, despite their immense magnitude, ample evidence of their commission, and despite all of that, despite the constant clamor of people like Niña Milagro and many others for there to be justice, there has not been in El Salvador. There's been decades instead of marginalization of people who suffered these crimes, and that's why the work that Niña Milagro is doing, and with the organization of which she is a part, Asociación Pro Búsqueda, is nothing short of, in my book, heroic. Right? She's speaking out against that official silence, the official silence of the government to say simply these things didn't happen. And she's demanding answers, not only answers in a courtroom, but also answers in her living room. She wants to have her family reunited again. And that's where some of our work comes in. So we've had the extraordinary privilege, what you see here is another one of our PhD students, Ursula, who couldn't be here today, and Dacia, who is now graduated, and they're talking to another woman who's a survivor of scorched earth policies in El Salvador, and hearing her story. The accounts of survivors like this woman or like Niña Milagro are the key starting place, as the director of Pro Búsqueda said, in that search for truth. Right? These people know what they went through, although courts have declined to listen to their story, although official state prosecutors have declined to take key steps forward to pursue justice in their name. They know what happened, and the first place in gathering the truth is talking to them. However, there's also key work that needs to be done to bring their stories more to light and to gather further evidence in those cases. And so that's what this conversation here is about, and what so many of the conversations that we have in the work that Emily and I do every day is about. Taking victims' testimonies, but then thinking, where can we corroborate these testimonies? What other evidence exists? What information exists and is perhaps not available to those victims, but may indeed be available to us? And that's where I come back to that point I said earlier. This is a tremendous opportunity for people like you and me to actually align ourselves with people like Niña Milagro and help find answers to some of the questions that they are asking. How could we have answers to her questions? Well, first of all, because as members of the University of Washington community, we have the wonderful privilege of access to one of the world's premier libraries that contains a ton of historical documents, archives of journalistic accounts from this period, databases that contain information that can shed light on cases as important as the whereabouts of her children. Now, I don't want to make it seem like this is an easy thing to do. We have teams of students that are combing through very obscure databases, very obscure, it's spending hours and hours and hours to find one little piece of information, and we've yet to find a case where in that little piece of information in the UW libraries we've said, oh, here's your child, right? That's the dream case. We have yet to get there. But what we have found is information that yields clues, and little clues that can be painstakingly pieced together with other clues to help paint a picture of what happened in El Salvador. Some of those clues are provided by the victims themselves, but some of them is provided by this historical information which simply doesn't exist in El Salvador because they don't have access to the kind of research tools we have. That's one thing. Our libraries are an immense resource. And another thing is our law provides us key tools in the United States to find out about what happened in the past. So because of Freedom of Information Act, the Freedom of Information Act in the United States grants us the ability to request of our government documents pertaining to any topic that you or I might want to pursue information about. And because our government was so heavily intertwined with the Salvadoran government throughout the war, we weren't just sending the checks, but also advising the military operations, demanding reports on what was happening. There were daily correspondence, and I'm not talking about one or two notes, but detailed and constant correspondence going back and forth between the United States and El Salvador, and those records exist in the United States government. Some of them have been declassified, and some of them have yet to be declassified. And so for several years, we have been involved in activities to look specifically at those US government documents and see what kind of information we can glean from them. We're very lucky this year to welcome Emily Willard to our team. She's a first-year PhD student in the Jackson School of International Studies, and before coming here to get her PhD, she worked for many years at the National Security Archive. Not the National Security Agency, which is the agency of the US government that's listening to our phone calls. The National Security Archive is an independent nonprofit that specializes in the use of FOIA law to obtain documents pertaining to US foreign policy with a particular interest in human rights concerns. So Emily is literally one of the experts in the nation on these issues, and we're very lucky to have her as a part of our team. So I'm going to turn the mic over to her, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about our work for FOIA.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us here. I'm really happy to get to know more people who are interested in this work. And I'm very grateful for Professor Godoy for inviting me to this event, but also for having me come work with her at the University of Washington. As she mentioned, I worked at the National Security Archive for many years and was very interested in human rights issues, kind of the research piece of it. You know, I kind of very literally sat in a dark little office, like flipping through declassified documents and papers and figuring out how do we get more of these, what do they say, why are they important. And I think about 5 years ago, I started working with Professor Godoy in relation to the Yellow Book, which was an El Salvadorian official government document that was leaked to her and some journalists, and we were at the archive working to help her validate the authenticity of the document and how you go about doing that and corroborating evidence from other documents. When I heard about her work at the University of Washington and how she wasn't also just sitting in a dark little office flipping through papers, she was actually engaging with students and bringing students down to the ground to meet the people who these documents are written about and these experiences, having this hands-on. So not just looking at the papers from an academic standpoint, but actually engaging with, and as Professor Godoy said, making a difference in people's lives, because like as an American citizen, I think it's a huge responsibility to look critically at our past and our role in human rights abuses. So came to work here with Professor Godoy and to work specifically on the Freedom of Information document gathering project. So several of us student researchers, we actually write the Freedom of Information Act requests, send them to the government agencies, and the government agencies can decide whether or not they give us information. Oftentimes they withhold it on the grounds of national security, and in particular, documents relating to El Salvador, Central American, Latin American human rights issues are withheld. Even though the Cold War is over, there's still concerns on the part of the US government that releasing this information about counterinsurgency campaigns and strategies would still damage national security. We always argue that the public interest and the need to access information so that people like Niña Milagro can find her children is more important than these kind of old, decrepit ideas around defending the country from communism. So that's one of the big arguments that we make, is that the public right to access this information is more important than these kind of old national security arguments, and that actually it's not this zero-sum game of you have to choose either or, and that in some cases it's protects national security and actually makes it more robust as more people have information that they need to access. And the most important, like nuclear location, plant locations are secret, that's fine, but it's this balance between public access and protecting national security interests. And that's something that we argue in these appeals that we write, arguing with the government about releasing information or making it public. So as student workers, we request the information, and then finally we do get information back. And so in this specific case, one of my colleagues, she sent a Freedom of Information Act request in, I think, April of this year, and in last year, so 2015, and very surprisingly, documents were released to us in October of this year, so right around the time we were having our Freedom of Information conference on the Seattle campus. So I wanted to show you some of the documents that we got released. We posted them in a report on our website that's available. You can read more of these documents and a deeper analysis. But so what can we learn from this information? So we were learning about, Professor Godoy is mentioning this kind of, these oh, there we go. Okay. So these counterinsurgency operations that the Salvadorian government would undertake with support of the United States, money and training. So this is an example of a State Department cable that was released to us. It was, I think the date was October, I can't actually see the date. Yeah, so October 10th, November 10th, 1981. And as you can see, there's a very clear record of what was going on the ground in El Salvador being transmitted back. So this was from the embassy in El Salvador, US Embassy, going back to the Secretary of State in Washington, D.C. And you can see, and this is actually quite chilling, how incredibly clear the information was about what was happening on the ground that Niña Milagro suffered herself. It says that there was widespread killing of camp followers, women and children. The person who was relaying this story said he is not certain, but attributes this more to troop frustration than command decision, and he believes that there was at least 200 civilian non-combatants killed. So this is like communication within the US government going from El Salvador to headquarters. And then in the very following days, or around this time, additional funds were sent to support the Salvadorian military. And so you can see through this this piece of evidence, which is very, government-based, knew what was going on, that very well corroborates the story of Niña Milagro. So as you can see, by having access to information like this, you can start to paint a picture of the context of which the violence happens. And when you have the stories of the eyewitnesses, you have this government information, and then when you have physical evidence, you can start to put together the picture of what actually happened. And so there's also another document that we got, this is a weekly violence report. So there's, again, this showing like there was this constant monitoring of what was going on. So there can't be the excuse of, oh, we never knew what was going on. There was very clear communication. However, with this one, it pointed out that while this massacre had happened, they were reporting lower levels of violence. So as you can see, there's lots of information available about, and we're trying to get more information like this about putting the pieces together to paint a more full picture.
Thanks, Emily. So both of these documents and several others were released to us pursuant to a request that we filed right around the time that we went down to El Salvador and met with Niña Milagro, and they both relate to the exact military operation about which she's speaking. And if you're interested, you can go to our website and see some of the other documents that came out and the lessons that we gleaned from them. There's they allow a very interesting angle both on U.S. policy and on what was happening in El Salvador at that time. This research gives us one view, but then there's the detailed research that people at ProBúsqueda do, which is tracing down, people who saw those children being loaded into a helicopter and reported where they went. And one of those children, so Niña Milagro lost two of her children. Two of her children were killed and two of her children were disappeared and taken away alive. What I neglected to mention, and I'm sorry that slide order is a little bit messed up, this is 2 weeks ago. This is the Friday before Martin Luther King weekend. And I hope you can see in the picture that's Niña Milagro herself. She's embracing her son. His name was Nicolás when he was taken from her at 4 years of age, almost 4. It was almost his 4th birthday. He was eventually given over to the Red Cross, who gave him to another family who raised him as an adoptive child. ProBúsqueda found him living in Australia. And when they thought that they had all the evidence in place to make a match, they never tell the families until they have absolute DNA confirmation, for obvious reasons. But the researchers at ProBúsqueda thought that they had made a match, and they sent him the video that you saw at the beginning of this presentation that my students made. And the story that the family told is that his adoptive brother said to him, "And if she was your mother, you have to do the DNA test." And he did, and she's his mother. And so 2 weeks ago, he went back to El Salvador for the first time in 35 years, and Niña Milagro had the chance to embrace him. I wasn't there, I can't imagine. I mean, I was sitting in Seattle, and I felt with every fiber of my body, I wished I could be there because we had a tiny little window on what an incredible process, right? An incredible prospect. And hundreds of these cases like this have been resolved in this way, where somebody has been found alive. At the same time, this is a moment of extraordinary joy, right? But at the same time, it also harkens back to the name that we chose for our campaign, which is Unfinished Sentences. Because ultimately, as happy as Niña Milagro is to know that her son survived, now they begin the arduous task of figuring out you can't make up for lost time. You can't reconstruct what has gone. This is a step towards healing, but it's only one step. And the healing process that she has now taken a significant step forward on still also remains open in the case of her disappeared daughter, who has yet to be found. And the fact that the courts have yet to address with justice any of these cases is also an alarming sign that change needs to happen. So Salvadorans, and that's what this picture I had it there to represent, are coming forward today in actually unprecedented numbers. Sometimes people say to me, well, There's lots of problems today in the world. Why are you focusing so much on problems that happened 35 years ago? That was a long time ago. But you wouldn't say that if you had sat down with Niña Milagro and you realize that every day she thinks about that unaddressed question of where her children are. And you wouldn't say that if you had the privilege to be there in the plaza where this gathering took place, where victims of the conflict, like the woman with the white hair you see there, were joined with people from generations that were born after the war, like the young woman you see here in the forefront, who are demanding attention to these cases. So in 2013, on the anniversary of the passage of that Amnesty Law, the 20th anniversary, I had the privilege to be in El Salvador when an unprecedented 43 different cases were presented by victims who came forward together demanding justice. There is real sign of momentum. At the same time, though, we have to be cautious in being too optimistic because there have yet to be strong indications of political will from the part of those who govern El Salvador. There is momentum among the victims movement that is important to recognize and to support. And so if we can support it through our research, if we can support it through our activity, it's a tremendous honor to be a part of such a force for good. There are, however, consequences to the Salvadorans who take leadership in such efforts. And this, you can't see this quite so well on the screen, but what this is an image taken in November 2013 of the offices of Probúsqueda. They've been ransacked. This was, I think, 4 or 5 days after they appeared before one of the Salvadoran courts to present a habeas corpus petition asking for information about forcibly disappeared children in cases like Niña Milagros. So people who are doing this work even this many years later do face acts of intimidation and harassment, and that's what makes it all the more important that we stand with them and that we support them. That's also why we at the Center for Human Rights are grateful for your support, and we'd love to invite you also to use the tools at your disposal as members of the university community. Perhaps not everybody should focus or could focus on El Salvador, but there are so many things that we can do here to support efforts at justice in our own communities and in communities near and far. So sometimes I think when we hear about these stories of just unimaginable human cruelty, and sadly they are so common, we think we can do very little. And actually there's a lot we can do, and there's a lot more that can be done to bring about a lot more happy embraces like the one you see here between Niña Milagro and her son Nicolás, now Germán. So I think I'll leave my comments there, but I would love to take questions, and I'm sure Emily will as well, from any of you, or comments. Thank you very much. Yes?
What was the purpose of displacing these children?
Excellent question. Why would people take children, right? Well, first of all, the violence in general, right, was driven by the idea that leftist Marxist ideas were a fundamental threat to the nation, and therefore anybody who was believed to be sympathetic to the guerrillas was a legitimate military target. In the case of people like Niña Milagro, that's because she lived in an area where some people did support the guerrillas, right? So that's what you get these major military operations called scorched earth, where they decide basically, and then this entire zone is full of guerrilla sympathizers, and we're going to liquidate them all. And I'm not exaggerating, that's the language that you see in these documents. And in fact, the one that Emily put on the screen talked about cleanup operations, and that's a euphemism for destroying those communities. So Niña Milagro fled with her children. Why were some children spared? Well, so why were some children slaughtered? Because the belief was such that these are people being raised with dangerous ideas that are going to be a threat to the nation, communism as a threat to the nation, etc. Why were some children spared? Well, for a variety of reasons. In some cases, it's because the individual person at that time took mercy on them, right? They were children. So sometimes it's an act of good-hearted goodwill. And those children were taken to orphanages or taken into other families to be raised. Sadly, sometimes, though, it's also an economic transaction because international adoption has always been a lucrative business. And during the war, there were many people who made a lot of money by selling into international adoption agencies children. The families who adopted those children had no idea that that was the nature of their origin. In fact, many of those families were probably motivated trying to do a good thing for somebody they were told was an orphan. They wouldn't have imagined that they could have had even a mother and father still looking for them to this day. Yes?
You said that the Red Cross had helped with taking up the children.
They have not, and that's it. So I want to be clear, the Red Cross did not take her children. The military took her children, and then they gave her son, we don't know what happened to her daughter still, her son over to the Red Cross, who then gave him in adoption to another family. So the Red Cross in El Salvador Red Cross is independent in each nation. The Red Cross in El Salvador has chosen not to collaborate with investigative activities of organizations like Pro Búsqueda, trying to find out where these children went. Yes? No. I mean, there are individuals in the United States government who have actually become champions of human rights in El Salvador and should be commended for that. But I would say the position of the United States government writ large, no. And there's more that the United States could do to support the cause of justice that we're not doing. Yes?
Was there any indication of why the Red Cross in El Salvador would not cooperate? That doesn't make any sense to me. Higher purposes.
I shouldn't speculate as to what their motives might be. There are cases, many cases of which I'm aware, however, of children that they helped in their orphanages and then that they gave in adoption to other families without carrying out an investigation to see if they might have birth families who were still looking for them. So one can imagine that that might color their motivation as to wanting to open their files about past practices. This is a common, I don't mean to comment to the Red Cross, but a common situation you may remember with the crisis in Haiti a few years ago. There's a common desire, which I think comes from a good place in all of our hearts, to help children who are orphaned in a humanitarian disaster. And there can be a rush, therefore, to adopt those children into new families without finding out if they have families that are still looking for them. That's happened in other conflicts as well, sadly. Yes? Yes. I don't know, and I wouldn't want to speculate about, well, I wouldn't want to speculate about that. I'm not trying to denounce the Red Cross. I think that there are particular cases here that call into question decisions that were made many years ago. But I haven't myself seen a comprehensive study of the Red Cross's adoption practices. And without that kind of comprehensive data, I don't want to malign them. Yes? That's a good question. So what made me focus on it? Well, first of all, I've been studying human rights in Central America previous to doing this work in El Salvador in particular. So I was already kind of working in this area and I knew some people. What made me decide to focus my attention on El Salvador in particular, which is something I've been doing, I guess I would say for about the last 5 years and wasn't my previous focus, was a request from Salvadoran human rights groups that convinced me that by paying attention to this, I and a larger community of which I'm a part could actually make a difference in producing better real-world human rights outcomes. So I think I really want to be very clear. I'm not suggesting El Salvador's atrocities are more painful than the atrocities of any other nation or uniquely important. I think we all have to find our place where we feel that we can make the most difference and plug in our energies in that place. And I feel that I've been enormously blessed by the chance not only to be a teeny, teeny little part of Niña Milagro's story, but you know, with the documents that Emily showed you, I've also had the enormous privilege of going back to families, not the specific documents she showed you, but documents like those, which we file as a matter of policy when any family in El Salvador who's looking for a loved one or to try to find out what happened to a loved one, even if they know that person is already dead, is trying to seek information, access to the truth, doors that have been closed to them for decades. We will request that information from the United States government. And in some of those cases, we've found documents that pertain to the disappearance of lost loved ones or the death of lost loved ones. It's always partial. It's always cloaked in strange diplomatic language, even language that may be offensive to people because of the way victims are depicted sometimes. It's always little bits of the truth. And at first, the first case that we came through where the person had asked us for the documents, we went through the process of requesting and obtaining the documents over many months. We got the documents back, and I went to sit down with the person. It was a daughter, a woman. She's about 25 years now old. Both of her parents were forcibly disappeared. And I went back to her and I said, I was almost embarrassed to give her these documents because neither of them said where the bodies lie. Neither of them told exactly the details of what happened, but they were little glimpses of what happened to her parents. And I gave her the documents and I said, I'm sorry, this is all we found. This is it. It was about 7 pages of documents. And she said to me, I'll never forget this, you have no idea. You have no idea. I've grown up my whole life trying to find any little bit of information. So you have no idea what this means to me, that you and a team of students that I've never even met spent time to try and find this. I'm going to put these pages, I have a file. She talked about a file. I'm going to put these pages in that file. That means so much to me. And then I've had that same, essentially, conversation now with many other victims who have said, you know, yeah, you're right, it's partial. Yeah, you're right, it's not just this. Yeah, you're right, this isn't what we ultimately want, but it's a piece closer to getting there. And the fact that a university in the United States and students in the United States would dedicate themselves to try to find this information and give me back this one little glimmer of it, it matters. And those are moments that I will never forget, and I feel so immensely privileged. It's not because of any act of whatever on my part, it's of being in the right place at the right time and possessed of a network of people committed to human rights to do that hard, arduous, needle in a haystack research, because that's what it takes. But to be able to deliver some little glimmer of something that once one victim said to me, this is a form of reparations. And I thought, my God, what an honor. Yes?
I'd like to hear more about the Freedom of Information Act and shine light on maybe what happened at UW regarding the CIA and paperwork and the withholding of information.
Okay, so do you have a specific question about FOIA?
I would like to know where are we on that process of information being withheld, and how does that affect the research?
Sure. Okay. So, as Emily mentioned, we've now filed many of these FOIA requests. We've filed over 200. I don't know the exact number we're at now, of 5 different U.S. government federal agencies. Each of them has their own sets of procedures, their own steps along the way. It's not like you just make a request and the documents come rolling in. It's very complicated. But in another case that we looked at, not the case of Niña Milagro, but the case of a massacre, which is called the Massacre of Santa Cruz, which took place in November 1981, actually about a month after the sweep through the area where she lives. This was another area of the country. There was a massacre that had never before been documented, and we had a chance to talk to some of the survivors of that massacre, of which there are many. We began doing research, conducting research into that massacre and trying to document it. And as part of that, we filed many FOIA requests. 2 particular FOIA requests that we filed. One was for information about a colonel whose name is Sigifreda Ochoa Perez, who was the commanding officer of the operation in which that massacre occurred. He's still alive. And another was for one of the victims of that massacre. He survived the massacre as well, but he was there and survived it. So we filed a request for information about those 2 things, and we filed that same request of multiple U.S. government agencies. The CIA responded to us that they could neither confirm nor deny the existence of records. In other words, they didn't say we don't have them or we have this number. That we can neither confirm nor deny the existence of records, and if there were to be records, we couldn't give them to you anyway because it would imperil U.S. national security. So it's that logic that Emily was talking about in her comments, this idea of withholding information that could be vital to the search for truth, let alone the search for justice in a courtroom, let alone the search for possibly helping families reunite, because there were children that disappeared in that massacre as well. Withholding that information and using the argument that this is for U.S. national security reasons. So as we continued to conduct more research on those particular cases, we found actually through our own research a large number of documents, 20 documents, that were CIA documents that had already been declassified by them pursuant to other people's requests. And so then we said, well, wait a minute, like, first of all, you're saying that you can't even acknowledge the existence of records, but here's 20 of your own records that we already have that you've given to other people. You could, at the very minimum, give us these 20 that we already have, because we already know they exist. They're already in the public domain. So we decided that the CIA, on that particular case, and there's other details that I'm glossing over, but for the sake of speed, in that particular case, the CIA was clearly not in compliance with the requirements of US federal law under the Freedom of Information Act, and we decided, after multiple appeals, we conducted multiple appeals, we went to independent mediation with the CIA, that failed. After everything else failed, we reached the end of the road, and we could either decide to give up or sue them. So we decided to sue them. And this wasn't a decision we took lightly. It was a decision, we are not an illegally independent entity. We are a dependency of the University of Washington. So this was a decision that had to be authorized at the highest levels of the University of Washington administration. And so that means when I say we sued them, I mean all of us. We all sued them, whether you guys knew it or not. It was done in our collective name. That case is currently proceeding. So it's before the courts as we speak. We are hopeful that it will yield the release of documents. Stay tuned. Yes? So what was it that was, I don't know the information, I don't think it's perfect, but what was it that was taken? Well, so we decided to sue the CIA, and we're waiting for them to give us these documents. When you say what was taken, you may be referring to the incident that happened in my office, which may or may not be related to the lawsuit against the CIA. We don't know. What happened in my office sometime between October 15th and 18th, while I was out of town, I was out of town for those days. I returned on October 18th, and I found that my office had been broken into, and my desktop computer, a big iMac, and a separately stored hard drive had been removed from my office. There were no signs of forced entry, no prints in the room. The police are investigating, and we don't know. Yes, Michael.
Dr. Godoy, could you share with us how our students might become more involved in this kind of research, this kind of work? And also, incidentally, might you mention the center's fellowships?
Yes. So let's start with that second point. The Center for Human Rights, one of the wonderful things that we have the enormous privilege of doing is administering funds that were given to us by private donors to try to support human rights efforts by people like you. So there's things that we spearhead, like this project where we're trying to carry it forward, but then there's other ideas that occur to you that may be better than the ideas that occur to us. And thankfully, we have some money to actually give you to help you carry out some of those ideas of your own. So we have money, competitive processes for selecting fellowships for both undergraduates and graduates, and they have slightly different requirements each one. If you were to Google Center for Human Rights and go to resources for students, you would be able to look into those. The deadlines are coming up in February and March, so it would be a good time to see what is available. And then in terms of how you can get involved, one of the challenges that we face with this work in particular is because, as maybe you get a sense, it's so highly technical looking at these very complex documents. We have a very technical team. Emily's one of the leaders of it. It's not the kind of thing that everybody can do from their own home. And so that means we're limited in terms of the number of student volunteers that we can take because we have to give you a lot of very intensive training. So right now, well, we're always accepting student volunteers, or we're always happy to receive applications from students who may want to be involved. But what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that unfortunately, it's not the kind of thing where you can like sign up today and tomorrow we'll have you, doing this work. There's a very long training process. So what I would say is going back to what I was trying to say before, this work in El Salvador has opened my eyes to differences that we can make by being good researchers right here at home. I really believe the same is true for so many other human conflicts, whether around the world or right here. A lot of times we don't think we can make a difference, and that's the problem, is our own inability to perceive ways that we can make a difference. So my goal isn't to recruit you to my particular cause, it's rather to recruit you to believe in whatever cause motivates you the most. The story I've had the privilege of experiencing has convinced me that that's how we can change the world best. Okay. Ooh. All right. We'll exit quickly. Thank you.